They said it was just a paper marriage, something to keep the peace for a few days, but by sunrise on the third morning, no one in that town could explain why she was still standing on his porch. The wind came low across the plains, dragging dust in thin lines past the fence posts that leaned like tired men, and Ethan Caldwell stood there with his hat in his hands, staring at a woman who was now, by law and by ink, his wife, even if neither of them had asked for it. Her name was Nayeli, and she did not look at him, not once, not when the preacher mumbled the words, not when the townsfolk stepped back like they'd touched something they didn't understand, and not when Ethan cleared his throat and said quietly, "You can take the bed, I'll sleep outside," because she had already turned her gaze to the horizon, to something farther than fences and wooden walls and white men with rules. The marriage had been arranged fast, faster than a storm rolling over dry land. One signature to stop a trade that should never have been spoken aloud, one agreement to keep her from being handed off like a sack of grain. And Ethan had stepped forward not because he wanted a wife, but because he couldn't stand the silence in that room when no one else did. The town called it kindness, some called it foolish, but Ethan never used either word. He just signed his name and stepped back, as if it meant nothing, as if it would end there. That first night, he left the door open and the lantern low, the smell of leather and wood smoke hanging in the air, and he heard her footsteps once, light, careful, stopping at the threshold like the floor itself was something she didn't trust. And when he woke before dawn, the bed was untouched, the blanket folded like it had never been disturbed, and outside, near the fence line, he saw her silhouette against the pale blue sky, standing still as if she had been there all night. He didn't call out, didn't ask questions, just walked to the well, drew water the way he always did, slow and steady, and set down 2 cups by the door before stepping away. Like leaving an offering he didn't have the right to explain. The sun climbed, burning the chill off the ground, and the town began to stir, boots on wood, voices low but sharp, people watching from a distance that pretended to be polite, but carried weight all the same, and Ethan could feel it without turning his head, the way men measure something they don't trust, the way women whisper behind hands when something doesn't fit the shape they expect. Nayeli moved through it all without reacting, her steps quiet, her eyes never settling on any face long enough to give them what they wanted. And when someone muttered, "He won't last a week," Ethan didn't answer, because he had already learned that words out here only made things louder, and louder wasn't always better. By midday, the heat pressed down like a hand, and Ethan worked the fence on the north side, hammer rising and falling in a rhythm that kept his thoughts from drifting too far. And when he reached for the nails, he noticed they had been set out already, lined up in the dirt with a precision that wasn't his. And for a second, he paused, looking toward the house. But there was no one there, only the door moving slightly in the breeze, like it had something to say and didn't know how. That evening, the sky turned the color of rust, and he returned to find the horse already watered, the bucket still swaying. And he knew then that whatever this marriage was supposed to be, it wasn't empty, not entirely, not anymore. They didn't speak that night either, just shared the same space in a way that felt less like distance and more like something waiting to be understood. And when the lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the walls, Ethan caught a glimpse of the necklace at her throat, a small piece of turquoise wrapped in worn leather, something old, something carried through more than just miles. And he looked away before she could notice, because some things didn't belong to him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the boards, whispering through the cracks, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, lonely and steady, the kind of sound that reminded a man how small he really was. And Ethan sat there, with his hands resting on his knees, feeling the weight of a choice he hadn't fully made, while across the room, Nayeli finally stepped inside, not all the way, just enough that the light touched her face, and for the first time, she looked at him, not with fear, not with anger, but with something quieter, something that didn't ask for anything, and didn't give anything away. And in that moment, neither of them moved, because sometimes the distance between two people isn't measured in feet or inches, but in the silence they're both still willing to hold on to. The second morning came slower, like the land itself was watching to see what would change and what would not, and Ethan woke to the sound of quiet movement again, not inside the house, but just beyond it, where the dust met the edge of the porch, and when he stepped outside with his boots half-laced and his hat still in his hand, he saw Nayeli crouched near the water trough, her fingers brushing along the rim as if she was testing something unseen. And for a moment, he thought she might leave, that she might walk straight past the fence line and never look back. But she did not. She only adjusted the bucket so it would not tip and stood, her posture straight, her eyes already scanning the horizon like someone who had learned long ago that stillness did not mean safety. Ethan said nothing, just walked past her to check the horses, the leather creaking soft under his grip, the animals shifting in a way that told him they were calmer than yesterday, and he noticed the way one of them nudged closer to the fence, closer to her, like it had already made a decision he had not, and that made him pause, just for a second, before he moved on. The sun climbed again, higher and sharper, burning the morning chill into something dry and restless, and the town carried on with its business. But there was a weight in the air now, a kind of waiting that did not belong to the land. It belonged to people, to eyes watching from behind windows and voices that stayed low but carried farther than they should, and Ethan felt it when he rode into town just after noon. The usual nod slower, the greetings shorter, and one man, a storekeeper with hands too clean for this place, leaned against the doorway and said, "You keeping her?" Like he was asking about a tool, not a person, and Ethan did not answer right away. He just tied off his horse and let the silence stretch until it made the man shift his weight. Then he said, "She is not something I keep," and walked past him without another word. Inside the store, the air smelled of flour and wood and something faintly sweet, and Ethan gathered what he needed. Salt, coffee, a strip of cloth for patching, and when he set the coins on the counter, the woman behind it glanced toward the door before leaning in slightly and saying, "You should be careful. People do not understand things like this." And Ethan met her gaze just long enough to make it clear he heard her, then nodded once, because he had learned that sometimes a nod carried more weight than any explanation. When he returned, the sun was already dropping, turning the sky into long streaks of gold and shadow, and he saw something different before he even reached the house. The door was open wider than he had left it, and for a moment his hand hovered near his side, not reaching for anything, just remembering the shape of caution. But then he stepped forward and found her inside, standing near the table, the 2 cups of water still untouched, and in her hands was the piece of cloth he had brought back, though he had not given it to her, had not even set it out, and she was folding it carefully, not like a stranger handling something borrowed, but like someone who understood its purpose without needing to be told. He stopped in the doorway, the light behind him casting a long shadow across the floor, and she looked up, not startled, not defensive, just aware, and for the first time she spoke before he did, her voice quiet but steady. "They watch you." And Ethan leaned his shoulder against the frame, crossing his arms slowly. "They always do," he said, and she held his gaze for a moment longer, then added, "More now." And there was no accusation in it, only a statement, like naming the weather, and Ethan exhaled through his nose, a small sound, almost a laugh, but not quite. "I figured," he replied, and for a moment that was enough. The space between them filled with something that did not need to be explained. Later, when the light faded and the shadows grew longer, he sat outside again, the wood beneath him still warm from the day, and he heard her steps behind him, closer this time, not stopping at the threshold, and she lowered herself to sit a few feet away, not beside him, not distant either, just enough space to say something without saying it, and the wind moved between them, carrying the scent of dust and sage. And after a while she reached into the fold of her clothing and drew out the small turquoise necklace, holding it in her palm like it carried more weight than it should, and Ethan did not ask about it, did not even turn fully toward her, but he saw it in the corner of his eye, the way the stone caught the last light of the day, and she spoke again, softer this time. This was given for a life saved, and Ethan's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of something deeper, something that did not belong to him, and he nodded once, slow. "Then it matters," he said, and she closed her hand around it again, the motion careful, deliberate, and for the first time since she had arrived, the silence that followed did not feel like distance. It felt like something beginning to take shape, quiet and unseen, but real enough that neither of them stood up to walk away. By the 3rd day, The air around the ranch had changed in a way that did not show itself in dust or wind, but in the way sound carried farther than it should, like footsteps that did not belong to the land but to intention, and Ethan felt it before he saw it. The subtle shift in the horses, the way their ears turned toward the road long before any rider appeared, and when he stepped out with the morning still cool against his skin, he saw Naeli already standing near the fence line again, her posture tighter now, her eyes not scanning but fixed, as if she had already found what she was looking for. He followed her gaze and saw nothing at first, just the long stretch of dry earth and pale grass, but then, far off, barely more than a shadow against the horizon, there was movement, slow, deliberate, not a traveler passing through, but someone who knew exactly where they were going, and Ethan did not speak, because there are moments when words only make a thing more real than it needs to be. He walked to the well, drew water like he always did, the rope creaking steady, and set down the 2 cups again, same as the days before. But this time he did not step away right after. He remained there, one hand resting lightly on the edge, waiting, not for her to come, but to see if she would. And after a few seconds, she did, her steps quiet, controlled, and she stopped just short of the cups, her eyes flicking once more toward the horizon before lowering. And she picked up one, holding it in both hands as if measuring its weight, then drank, not fast, not cautious, just steady, and when she set it down, she did not move away immediately. "They are not from your town," she said, her voice low, but clear enough to carry across the small distance between them, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze still outward. "No," he replied, "they are not." And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something building, something neither of them named. The sun climbed, and with it the shape on the horizon grew clearer, resolving into riders, 3, maybe 4, moving at a pace that was neither rushed nor slow, the kind of pace that spoke of certainty, and Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, not exactly, but the awareness that whatever balance had been holding these past days was about to be tested. He turned then, finally, looking at Naeli fully, and for the first time there was something different in his expression, not distance, not uncertainty, but a question he did not ask out loud, and she met it without hesitation, her chin lifting slightly. "They will ask you to step aside," she said, and Ethan's jaw shifted just enough to show he understood. "And if I do not?" he asked, his voice even, and she held his gaze for a long second before answering. "Then they will know you have already chosen." And that hung between them, heavier than anything spoken before, because choice, out here, was never just a word. It was a line drawn in dust that could not be taken back. The riders came closer by midday, their shapes now clear, hats low, movements controlled, and they did not call out as they approached, did not announce themselves the way townsfolk did. They simply rode until they were close enough to be seen, then stopped, their horses still, their presence enough. And Ethan stepped forward from the porch, not aggressive, not welcoming either, just present, his hands loose at his sides, his posture straight. And Naeli remained where she was, a few steps behind, not hidden, not displayed, simply there. And for a moment, no one spoke, the air holding that stillness that comes before something shifts. One of the riders finally moved, dismounting with a slow, deliberate motion, his boots hitting the ground without sound. And though Ethan could not hear the words exchanged between him and Naeli, he saw the way her shoulders squared, the way her hand lifted briefly to touch the turquoise at her throat, and something in that gesture told him this was not a simple visit, not a passing moment, but something that reached back further than this place, further than him. The man spoke again, his tone measured, not forceful, but carrying weight all the same, and Naeli answered, her voice steady, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not step in, because he understood now that this was not something he could control, only something he could stand within. After a moment, the man's gaze shifted to Ethan, not hostile, not welcoming, just assessing, and Ethan met it without flinching, because there was no reason to look away, not anymore. And though no words were spoken between them, something passed all the same, something quiet but clear, like an understanding that did not need translation. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against the boards of the house, carrying with it the faint scent of sage, and in That moment, Naeli stepped forward, closing the space between her and Ethan by just a single step, not enough to touch, but enough to change the shape of the moment, and she spoke again, this time in English. Her voice softer but no less certain. "I can go with them," she said, and Ethan's eyes flickered, just once, before settling again. "I know," he replied, and that was all. No demand, no plea, just acknowledgement, and for a long second, nothing moved, not the riders, not the horses, not even the dust, and then the man gave a slight nod, not to Ethan, but to Naeli, and stepped back, leaving the space open. The choice unspoken but undeniable, and Ethan did not move to fill it. He did not reach out, did not step closer. He simply stood there, steady as the fence posts that had weathered more years than he could count, because some things, once given, could not be taken back, and whatever this was between them, it had already crossed that line. The space between them did not close, and that was what made it real, because neither of them tried to take it back. Not the man who stood still as the fence behind him, and not the woman who had every reason to walk away. The riders waited, not impatient, not pressing, just present in the way the land itself can be present, and Naeli stood there with the wind moving softly through her hair, her hand still resting near the turquoise at her throat, as if it carried more than memory, as if it held the weight of every step that had led her here. Ethan shifted his stance only slightly, his boots pressing into the dry earth, leaving marks that would not last past the next wind, and yet he did not move forward, did not speak again, because he understood now that whatever this was, it could not be claimed, it could only be chosen. One of the horses snorted quietly, the sound small but enough to break the stillness, and the man who had dismounted earlier glanced once more at Naeli, his expression unreadable to anyone who did not know him, but she did, and something in her shoulders changed, not in fear, not in resistance, but in recognition, the kind that comes when a path you once walked is laid out before you again. She took a step, not toward Ethan, not yet, but forward into the open space between the two worlds that had been pulling at her since the moment she arrived, and the dust shifted. Under her feet, a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been, and for a moment it felt like everything held its breath. Ethan watched her, not with expectation, not with demand, just with a steady gaze that did not follow her steps too closely, because he had learned that watching too hard could turn a choice into a burden, and he would not do that to her, not after everything that had already been taken without asking. The man spoke again, a few quiet words, and this time Ethan caught a single sound he recognized, her name, carried on a tone that was neither command nor plea, just a reminder, and Naeli did not answer right away. She simply stood there, the wind brushing against her clothing, the sunlight catching the edge of the turquoise stone so that it flashed once, briefly, like something alive. She looked toward the riders, then back toward the house, her gaze moving slowly, taking in the worn boards, the open door, the two cups still resting near the well, and something in her expression softened, not enough to change its shape completely, but enough to show that what she saw here was no longer empty, no longer something she stood outside of. Ethan noticed it, the way a man notices a shift in the weather before the sky changes color, and he let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, not in relief, not yet, but in acceptance of whatever would come next. Another moment passed, then another, each one stretching longer than the last, and finally Naeli moved again, this time turning fully toward the riders, taking 2 steps in their direction, enough to close part of the distance, enough to show that she had heard them, and Ethan remained where he was, his posture unchanged, his hands still at his sides, because this was the part where he did nothing, the part where doing something would mean taking away the very thing that mattered. The man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her movement, and one of the other riders shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking softly, a sound that carried across the space like a question, and Naeli stopped there, not reaching them, not returning, just standing in the middle, and for a second, it seemed as if the world itself had paused, waiting for a single motion to decide everything. She lowered her hand from the necklace, letting it rest against her chest, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying just enough to reach both sides. "I know the way back," she said, and the words settled into the air with a weight that was not heavy, but final, And the man studied her for a long moment before giving a slow nod, the kind that comes from understanding more than agreement. And he stepped back toward his horse, not turning away completely, but releasing the space he had held. Ethan watched this without moving, his eyes steady, his expression unreadable to anyone who did not know him. And though no one spoke to him directly, the absence of words said enough. Because in that moment he was not being asked to do anything. He was being allowed to remain exactly where he stood. Nayeli turned then, not sharply, not hesitantly, just a quiet shift of her body that brought her gaze back to the house, to the man who had not tried to hold her, and she took a step, then another, each one measured, each one certain, and the distance she had created began to close again, not quickly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt more permanent than any sudden movement could. The riders did not stop her, did not call out again. They simply watched, their presence still, their understanding unspoken. And when she reached the edge of the porch, she paused for a fraction of a second, her hand brushing lightly against the wood as if confirming it was real, then stepped up and crossed the threshold without looking back. Ethan did not move immediately. He remained where he was for one more breath, one more second, letting the moment settle into something he could carry. And then he turned, slow and steady, and walked toward the house, not to follow, not to lead, but to meet her halfway, and behind him. The riders mounted their horses without sound, turning back the way they had come, leaving nothing behind but a faint line in the dust that would soon disappear, as if they had never been there at all. The dust settled long after the riders disappeared, but the feeling they left behind did not. It lingered in the boards of the house, in the quiet between footsteps, in the way the air itself seemed to listen, and Ethan stepped onto the porch just as Nayeli moved fully inside, the door shifting slightly behind her with a soft creak that sounded louder than it should have, like something marking a moment neither of them would speak about. He paused at the threshold, not entering right away, his hand brushing against the worn frame, feeling the grooves carved by years of weather and time. And for a second, he let his eyes rest on her back, the way she stood near the table, still but not distant, present in a way she had not been before, and he realized that what had changed was not where she stood, but why she remained. He stepped in quietly, the floorboards answering under his weight, and she did not turn, not immediately, but her shoulders shifted just enough to show she knew he was there, and the silence between them stretched again, but it no longer carried uncertainty. It carried something steadier, something chosen. Ethan moved to the side, setting his hat down on the table with a slow, deliberate motion, then reached for one of the cups by the door, lifting it, turning it slightly in his hand before placing it back exactly where it had been. And finally he spoke, his voice low, even. "They will come back." And Nayeli nodded once, not in fear, not in resistance, just acknowledgement. "Yes," she said, and that was all, because both of them understood that some things did not need to be explained to be real. The light shifted as the afternoon wore on, sliding across the floor in long, quiet lines, and Ethan returned to his work outside, not because the fence needed fixing, not today, but because movement kept a man steady when his thoughts threatened to wander too far. And as he worked, he felt her presence behind him again, not watching, not judging, just there. And after a while he noticed the small things, the bucket refilled. Before he reached for it, the loose board near the gate adjusted before it could fall, the kind of actions that spoke without asking for notice, and he did not comment on them, did not thank her, because gratitude, spoken too soon, can turn something simple into something heavy, and neither of them wanted that. By late afternoon, the heat softened, the wind carrying a cooler edge that hinted at evening, and Ethan leaned against the fence, wiping his hands slowly, his gaze drifting toward the open land beyond. And for the first time in days, it did not feel like something closing in. It felt like something holding still, waiting. Nayeli stood a few feet away, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been before. And after a long stretch of silence, she spoke, her voice quieter than the wind. "Why did you not ask me to stay?" And Ethan did not answer right away. He let the question settle, turning it over in his mind the way a man turns over a stone he is not sure he should pick up. And then he said, "Because if I had to ask, it would not mean the same." And she looked at him then, really looked, not past him, not through him, but at him, and something in her expression shifted again, subtle, but unmistakable. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard like fingers reaching for something just out of sight, and Ethan moved to gather what tools he had left, his motion slower now, less about finishing and more about closing the day. And when he turned back toward the house, he saw her standing in the doorway, the light behind her outlining her shape in a way that made her seem both part of the place and separate from it. And he realized then that this was the first time she had stood there not as someone passing through, but as someone who belonged to the space, even if she had not said it out loud. He walked toward her, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. And when he reached the porch, he paused for a moment before stepping up, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second. And in that glance there was no question left, no distance that needed measuring, only the quiet understanding that whatever had begun here was no longer something temporary. Inside, the air felt different, warmer somehow, though the fire had not been lit, and Ethan moved to the table, setting down his tools, his hands lingering there for a moment as if grounding himself. And Nayeli stepped aside just enough to let him pass, her movement small but intentional, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something new, something softer but stronger all at once. "This place," she said, pausing just long enough to choose her words. "It does not feel empty anymore." And Ethan glanced at her, not surprised, not questioning, just accepting. And he nodded once, slow and steady, because he felt it too, in the way the silence no longer pressed against him, in the way the walls seemed to hold something more than memory. Outside, the wind moved gently across the land, carrying away the last traces of the riders who had come and gone, leaving nothing behind but a moment that had already taken root. And as the light faded and the first hint of night settled in, Ethan reached for the lantern, lighting it with a steady hand, and set it between them, not as a barrier, not as a distance, but as something shared, its glow soft and constant, casting both of their shadows onto the same wall, no longer separate, no longer unsure, just there, side by side, in a space that neither of them had planned, but both had chosen. The night settled slower than the days had passed, stretching across the land like a long breath that no one rushed to release. And inside the house the lantern burned steady, its soft glow resting between Ethan and Nayeli as if it belonged to neither of them alone. And for a while neither spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence had finally become something they could stand inside without needing to fill it. Ethan sat with his hands resting on the table, fingers still marked with dust and work, while Nayeli remained near the doorway, not outside, not fully inside either, but closer than before, and the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like something waiting to be crossed without force. The wind moved against the walls in low, steady strokes, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sage, and somewhere far off a night bird called once, then again. A quiet rhythm that seemed to echo the stillness inside. Ethan finally shifted, leaning back slightly, his gaze lifting toward the door, then back to her, and he spoke in the same even tone he had carried since the beginning. "You do not have to stand there." And it was not an invitation, not a command, just a simple truth placed between them. Nayeli did not answer right away, her eyes resting on him for a moment before she moved, one step forward, then another, slow and certain, until she reached the table. And she did not sit, she simply stood across from him, her hand brushing lightly against the wood as if feeling its grain, grounding herself in something that had not been hers before. "In my world," she said quietly, her voice steady but softer than the wind. "A place is not yours until you stay when you are free to leave." And Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes sharpened slightly, like a man recognizing a truth he had not put into words. He nodded once, slow. "Then this place is yours now," he replied, not looking away, not adding anything more. And for a second her gaze faltered, not in doubt, but in something deeper, something that came from hearing a thing spoken plainly when it had been expected to be earned. The lantern flickered slightly, its light shifting across the walls, blending their shadows together in a way that made it hard to tell where one ended and the other began. And Nayeli lowered herself into the chair across from him, her movements careful but not hesitant, and that alone changed the room. made it feel smaller, closer, more real. Ethan reached for the second cup, filling it again from the pitcher without looking down, then slid it across the table, stopping it just within her reach, and she watched his hand as it moved, not the gesture itself, but the absence of anything behind it, no expectation, no demand, just the offering of something simple. She took the cup, holding it for a moment before drinking, and when she set it down, she did not pull her hand away immediately, her fingers resting against the edge as if marking her place. "They will not understand," she said after a while, her voice quieter now, and Ethan let out a small breath, something close to a dry laugh, but without humor. "They never do," he answered, and for the first time there was a faint shift in his tone, not frustration, not resignation, just acceptance of something that had been true long before she arrived. Outside, the wind eased, the night settling deeper, and the sounds of the land grew softer, more distant, as if the world itself had stepped back to give this moment room to exist. Nayeli lifted her gaze again, meeting his directly, and there was something new in it now, not guarded, not distant, but open in a way that carried its own kind of strength, and she said, "In my world, when two people share a fire, they are no longer strangers," and Ethan glanced at the lantern between them, its light steady, its warmth quiet, and he nodded once more, slower this time. "Then we are not strangers," he said, and the words settled into the space between them without weight, without resistance. The hours passed without notice, the kind of time that does not measure itself in minutes, but in moments that stretch and settle, and when Ethan finally stood, it was not to leave, not to create distance, but simply to move, to step outside for a breath of air, and Nayeli watched him go without question, without concern, because she knew now he would return. He stood on the porch, the night cool against his skin, the stars spread wide above like something endless and quiet, and for the first time in a long while, the land did not feel empty to him. It felt full in a way he could not name, and when he turned back toward the door, he saw her there again, not waiting, not watching, just standing within the light, and he stepped inside without hesitation, closing the distance between them with the same steady certainty that had carried him through every moment before. And as the lantern burned low and the night deepened, neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left to prove, only something to continue, quiet and unspoken, but no longer uncertain. Morning came without announcement, just a slow wash of pale light slipping through the cracks in the wooden walls, and Ethan was already awake before it reached the table, sitting with his elbows resting lightly on his knees, listening to the quiet in a way that felt different now, less like waiting and more like knowing. Nayeli stood near the window, not watching the horizon this time, but the yard itself, the small details that had once meant nothing to her, the line of fence posts, the bucket by the well, the place where his boots always paused before stepping inside. And there was something in the way she looked at it all that suggested she was no longer measuring distance. She was recognizing patterns. Ethan rose without speaking, moving toward the door, his hand brushing against the frame as he stepped out, and she followed a moment later, not behind him, not separate either, just within the same rhythm, and the air carried that early chill that fades fast under the western sun, a thin layer of cool that sat on the skin before the heat claimed it. The horses shifted as they approached, their movements calm, familiar, and Ethan reached for the nearest one, checking the strap along its side, his fingers moving with practiced ease, and when he stepped back, Nayeli moved forward without asking, adjusting the rope near the post with a quiet precision that made the animal settle even more, and Ethan watched that for a second, not surprised, but aware that what she did was not learned here. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere carried with her long before this place. "You know horses," he said, not as a question, just a statement, and she gave a small nod, her eyes still on the animal. "They listen when you do not rush them," she replied, and Ethan let out a soft breath, something close to agreement. "Most things do," he said, and that was all, but it stayed between them like a shared understanding that did not need to be explained further. The day stretched forward, quiet and steady, and they worked without planning it, not dividing tasks, not assigning roles, just moving through the space in a way that began to feel natural. And as the sun climbed, Ethan found himself noticing how often their paths crossed without collision, How she anticipated small things before he reached for them. The way she handed him the hammer before he asked. The way he stepped aside without thinking when she moved past. And it was not coordination. Not yet. It was something closer to instinct. The kind that grows when two people stop guarding every step. By midday, the heat pressed down hard. The kind that makes the air shimmer above the ground. And Ethan leaned against the fence again, wiping his hands with a cloth that had seen better days, and Naeli stood nearby, her gaze lifting toward the far edge of the land, not searching this time, just looking, and after a while she spoke, her voice low but clear. In my home, the land speaks through what does not change, and Ethan followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly against the light. Out here, it is the same, he said. You just have to stay long enough to hear it. And she glanced at him then, not questioning, not testing, just acknowledging, as if something in his words aligned with something she already knew. The afternoon moved slower, the kind of slow that settles into the bones, and they returned to the house when the sun began to dip, the light turning softer, stretching shadows across the yard like long fingers reaching back toward the day, and inside, the air held that quiet warmth again, the lantern unlit but ready. The table still bearing the marks of their last shared moment, and Ethan set down his tools without thought, his movements familiar, while Naeli paused near the doorway, her hand brushing lightly against the wood once more, the same gesture she had made before, but this time it carried less uncertainty, more recognition. Your town, she said after a moment, her voice steady. They will come again, and Ethan nodded, not turning to face her right away. They will, he replied. And there was no tension in it, no resistance, just a calm acceptance that felt heavier than denial ever could. He moved to the table, filling the cups again, the water catching the last light of the day, and slid one toward her. And when she took it, their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, not enough to linger, not enough to claim, just enough to mark that something had shifted beyond words, and neither of them pulled away quickly, neither reacted, they simply continued. Because sometimes the smallest contact carries more weight than anything spoken aloud. Outside, the wind returned, softer now, carrying the scent of cooling earth, and the world beyond the house felt distant in a way that made this place feel closer, more defined. And as the first hints of evening settled in, Ethan lit the lantern again, its glow steady, familiar, and set it between them without thinking. The same quiet ritual as before. But this time it did not feel like a gesture. It felt like a habit, something already becoming part of what they were building without naming. Naeli sat across from him once more, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, and after a long stretch of silence, she spoke again, her voice softer but certain. You did not ask me to stay, she said, repeating the truth in a different form, and Ethan met her eyes, his expression unchanged but deeper somehow. You did not need me to, he answered, and the words settled into the space between them, with a quiet finality, not closing anything, but opening something else entirely, something that neither of them rushed to define, because out here, the things that last are never the ones forced into shape too soon. The next morning did not arrive with peace. It arrived with a sound that did not belong to the land, a distant rhythm carried low across the plains, steady and deliberate. And Ethan heard it before the light fully broke over the horizon, his eyes opening to a stillness that felt too complete, like the world was holding something back. He sat up slowly, listening, the faint echo of hooves reaching him through the walls, not many, not a crowd, but enough to matter, and when he stepped outside, the air felt sharper than it should have, the kind that settles into the chest and stays there. Naeli was already awake, standing near the edge of the yard, her posture still, her gaze fixed on the same distant line where sky met earth, and this time there was no question in her stance, only recognition. Ethan moved to stand beside her, not too close, not distant either, and for a moment they said nothing, because both of them already understood that whatever was coming was not like before. It was not a visit, not a choice left open. The figures on the horizon grew clearer as the sun rose, resolving into riders, more than the last time. Their movement slower but heavier, the kind that carries intention rather than uncertainty, and Ethan felt the weight of it settle in his chest, not fear, but the quiet knowledge that this moment would ask something of him, something he could not step away from. They come with more voices, Naeli said softly, her words measured, and Ethan nodded once, his eyes narrowing slightly against the light. Then they expect an answer, he replied, and the silence that followed carried more weight than anything spoken before. The horses near the fence shifted uneasily, their ears flicking toward the approaching riders, and Ethan moved to steady them, his hand resting against the nearest one, grounding himself as much as the animal. And when he stepped back, Naeli had not moved, her gaze still fixed, her hand resting lightly against the turquoise at her throat as if it anchored her in place. The riders reached the edge of the property by midday, their numbers now clear, 5, maybe 6, enough to fill the space without overwhelming it. And they did not stop far off this time. They rode closer, their presence pressing into the yard like a question that demanded to be heard. Ethan stepped forward from the porch, his posture steady, his hands loose at his sides, and Naeli remained just behind him, not hidden, not shielded, simply present. And for a moment the air held that same stillness as before, but this time it felt tighter, more fragile, like something could break if pushed too far. One of the riders dismounted, an older man by the look of him, his movements controlled, deliberate, and when he spoke, his voice carried low and even, not raised, not harsh, but carrying enough weight to reach both of them without effort. And though Ethan did not understand the words, he understood the tone. It was not a request. It was a reckoning. Naeli stepped forward then, moving past Ethan without hesitation, her posture straight, her eyes meeting the man's with a calm that did not bend, and she answered him in the same steady tone, her voice carrying a quiet strength that did not need to rise to be heard. The exchange continued, low and measured, the kind of conversation that carries more meaning in what is not said than in what is, and Ethan stood where he was, his gaze steady, not interrupting, not stepping in, because he knew this was not his voice to carry, only his place to hold. After a moment, the man's gaze shifted toward Ethan, not hostile, not questioning, just aware, and in that look there was something new, not judgment, not dismissal, but consideration, as if he was measuring not just what he saw, but what had already happened here. Naeli turned slightly then, her eyes meeting Ethan's for a brief second, and in that glance there was no uncertainty, no searching, only a quiet clarity that had not been there before, and she spoke again, this time in English, her voice softer but carrying just enough to reach him. "They ask if I was taken," she said, and Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, not in defense, but in the weight of the question itself, and he answered simply, "You were not." And she held his gaze for a moment longer before turning back to the man, repeating the answer in her own words, her tone steady, unshaken. The air shifted then, something subtle but unmistakable, like a line had been drawn and recognized by all who stood there. And the man studied her for a long moment before giving a slow nod, not of agreement, not of surrender, but of understanding, and he stepped back slightly, creating space rather than closing it. The other riders remained still, their presence unchanged, but the tension that had filled the yard began to ease, not disappearing, but settling into something quieter, something more defined. Naeli stepped back toward Ethan, not retreating, not seeking shelter, just returning to the place she had chosen, and she stood beside him, not behind, not apart. And for the first time, the space between them felt fully closed, not by distance, but by decision. The man mounted his horse again, his movements as controlled as before, and without another word, the riders turned, their path leading them back across the open land, leaving behind nothing but the faint imprint of hooves that would soon fade. Ethan remained where he was, watching until they disappeared into the horizon, and when he finally turned, his eyes met Naeli's, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to prove, only something that had already been decided without force, without demand. And as the wind moved softly across the yard once more, carrying away the last trace of what had come and gone, Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension leaving him in a quiet release. And Naeli lowered her hand from the turquoise at her throat, her posture easing in a way that spoke not of relief, but of certainty. And in that moment, the land around them felt steady again, not because nothing had changed, but because something had. The land stayed quiet after they left, But it was not the same quiet as before. It carried something settled, something that had found its place and no longer needed to prove it existed. And Ethan stood there for a while longer than necessary, his gaze fixed on the horizon even after the last trace of movement had disappeared, because sometimes a man needs to see the end of a moment before he can turn away from it. When he finally did, the shift was small, just a turn of his shoulders, a slow breath released through his nose. And when his eyes found Nayeli again, she had not moved far, only a step back toward the porch, her posture no longer rigid, no longer held by the weight of expectation, but steady in a way that felt chosen. Neither of them spoke at first, because the silence now carried meaning. It held what had just happened without needing to be broken apart into words, and Ethan stepped toward the house, his boots pressing into the dirt with the same measured rhythm as always, and she followed, not behind him, not beside him, but within the same pace, the kind that forms when two people stop thinking about where to stand. Inside, the air felt warmer than it should have, not from the heat, but from something else, something that had taken root in the space without being named. And Ethan moved to the table, his hand brushing against the wood, as if confirming it was still there, still real. And Nayeli paused near the door for only a moment before stepping fully inside again, the threshold no longer a place she hesitated at. "They will not return for this," she said quietly after a while, her voice carrying a calm certainty that did not need explanation. And Ethan nodded once, not questioning, because he had seen it too in the way the riders left, in the way nothing had been taken. Nothing demanded. "No," he replied. They got their answer, and he let the words settle, not adding more, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend. The afternoon stretched out slow and steady, the kind of time that moves without notice, and they returned to their work, not because it needed to be done, but because it grounded them, kept the world simple in a way that moments like that could not. And Ethan found himself moving through the motions with less weight than before, his hands steady, his thoughts quieter, and every so often he would glance toward her without meaning to, noticing the way she moved now with familiarity, the way she adjusted small things without pause, the way she no longer seemed to measure every step as if it might be her last in that place. By late afternoon, the lights softened again, turning the land into long shadows and quiet color, and Ethan leaned against the fence once more, the same place he had stood so many times before. But this time it did not feel like waiting. It felt like staying, and Nayeli stood a few feet away, her gaze not fixed on the horizon now, but on the land itself, as if she was learning its shape in a different way, not as something to pass through, but as something to understand. After a while, she spoke, her voice low, thoughtful. "In my home, when a path is chosen, it is not spoken again." And Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering that, then nodded. "Out here, it is the same," he said. "Once a man decides, he does not keep saying it." And there was a quiet agreement in that, something that settled between them like the dust after wind, not gone, but no longer moving. The sun dipped lower, the air cooling with it, and they returned to the house as the first hints of evening crept in, the lantern waiting where it always was, and Ethan lit it without thought, the small flame catching and growing into a steady glow that filled the room with familiar light. And he set it down between them again, the same as before, but now it felt less like a gesture and more like a part of the day, something that belonged. Nayeli sat across from him once more, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the table, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, not searching, not questioning, just seeing. And Ethan spoke then, his voice quiet, steady. "You stayed." And it was not a question, not a demand, just an acknowledgement. And she held his gaze, her expression calm but carrying something deeper. "I chose," she replied, and the words were simple, but they carried everything that had not been said before, everything that had led to this moment. Ethan nodded once, slow and certain, and leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes lowering for a second before lifting again. And there was something different in them now, not guarded, not distant, but open in a way that came only after a man stops expecting something to be taken from him. Outside, the wind moved softly across the land, carrying the last warmth of the day with it, and the world beyond the house felt quiet again, not empty, but settled. And inside, the lantern burned steady, its light casting both of their shadows onto the wall once more, side by side, not overlapping, not separate, just there, and for a long while neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left to explain, only something to continue, something that did not need words to exist, something that had already become real in the only way that mattered. The days that followed did not rush forward. They unfolded the way the land does after a storm that never quite arrived, slow, steady, and almost too quiet for a man used to watching for change. And Ethan found himself waking before the light again, not because something pulled him from sleep, but because there was something in the stillness that felt worth meeting early. He stepped outside with the same familiar motion, boots settling into the dust, breath steady, and for a moment he simply stood there, listening, not for danger, not for movement, but for the absence of both. And it was there, clear and open, stretching across the plains like a promise that did not need to be spoken. Nayeli joined him a moment later, not announcing herself, not lingering at the doorway, just stepping into the same space as if it had always been hers to enter. And they stood side by side without looking at each other, their attention on the horizon. That no longer felt like something distant, but something shared. The morning carried on with its quiet rhythm, the horses shifting gently, the fence holding steady, the well rope creaking in a sound that had become part of the day, and Ethan moved through it all without thinking, his hands working, his steps measured, and every so often he would notice her already there, already adjusting something before he reached it, already understanding what needed to be done without being told, and it did not feel like help. It felt like something else, something that belonged to both of them now. By midday, the sun pressed down with that familiar weight, the kind that settles into the shoulders and reminds a man where he stands, and Ethan paused near the fence, wiping his hands slowly, his gaze drifting across the land, and he realized that for the first time in a long while, he was not measuring the distance to the next town, not counting the days since someone had passed through. He was simply looking, and that alone felt different. Nayeli stood a few feet away, her posture relaxed, her gaze following the same line of sight, and after a while she spoke, her voice quiet but certain. In my home, when the land grows quiet like this, it means it has accepted who walks on it. And Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering that, then nodded once. Out here, it means the same, he said. It just takes longer for a man to hear it. And there was something in that exchange that settled deeper than before, something that did not need to be repeated to remain true. The afternoon passed without interruption, no riders on the horizon, no voices carried by the wind, just the steady presence of the land and the quiet work that filled the hours. And when the light began to soften, Ethan returned to the house with the same deliberate steps, setting down his tools without pause, his movements guided more by habit than thought. And Nayeli followed, not behind him, not apart, just within the same motion, her hand brushing lightly against the doorframe as she stepped inside, the gesture now familiar, no longer uncertain. The lantern was lit as the evening settled in, its glow casting a warm circle that held the room together, and Ethan set 2 cups on the table again, filling them without looking, his hand steady, and when he slid one toward her, she took it without hesitation, her fingers brushing the wood in the same quiet way, and for a moment they simply sat there, the light between them steady, the silence no longer something to cross, but something to rest within. After a while, Ethan spoke, his voice low, carrying the same calm he had held since the beginning. You could still leave, and it was not a question, not a test, just a truth placed gently between them. And Nayeli looked at him, her expression unchanged but deeper, her eyes holding something that had grown over these days without being named, and she answered without pause. I could, she said, and the words did not carry doubt, only clarity, and for a moment the silence returned, not heavy, not uncertain, just present. Ethan nodded once, his gaze lowering briefly before lifting again, and he did not add anything more, because he understood that some answers do not need to be followed, they need to be left where they stand. Outside, the wind moved softly across the land, carrying with it the scent of cooling earth, and the world beyond the house felt distant in a way that made the space between them feel closer, more defined, and as the lantern flickered slightly, its light shifting across the walls, Their shadows stretched and moved together in a way that no longer felt separate. And in that moment, neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left to explain, only something to continue, something that had already taken shape in the quiet choices made without force, without demand. And as the night settled deeper, Ethan leaned back slightly, his posture easing in a way it had not before, and Nayeli remained where she was, her presence steady, her gaze calm, and between them, the silence held not distance, but something stronger, something that had become real in the only way that mattered, not by words, not by promise, but by staying when leaving was still an option. The following morning did not feel like the ones before, not because anything had changed in the land, but because something had begun to settle deeper between them, something that made even the smallest sounds carry more meaning than they should. And Ethan woke to that quiet again, the kind that did not press against him but held him steady. And when he stepped outside, the sky was still pale, the horizon just beginning to take shape. And for a moment he stood there without moving, letting the air fill his lungs slow and even. Nayeli was already there, not at the edge of the yard this time, not watching the distance, but closer, near the well, her hand resting lightly against the rope as if feeling the weight of it without pulling. And when she looked at him, there was no question in her eyes, no distance left to measure, only something calm, something certain. Ethan nodded once, not greeting, not signaling anything more than acknowledgement, and moved past her to begin the morning work, his hands steady, his steps familiar, and she followed not as someone learning, not as someone observing, but as someone who already knew where to stand, where to move. The rhythm of the place no longer something she borrowed, but something she carried. The hours passed in that same quiet pattern, the kind that builds without being noticed, and by midday the sun had climbed high, pressing its weight across the land. And Ethan leaned against the fence again, wiping his hands slowly, his gaze drifting out across the open stretch that no longer felt empty. And Nayeli stood nearby, her posture relaxed, her attention not fixed on anything distant, but present, here. And after a while she spoke, her voice low, thoughtful. In my home, when two people choose the same path, they do not walk it alone anymore. And Ethan glanced at her, his expression steady, considering the words before answering. Out here, a man learns that too late most times, he said, then paused, his gaze returning to the horizon, or not at all. And there was something in the way he said it that carried more than just agreement, something that reached back further than this place, further than her. The afternoon moved on without interruption, the land holding its quiet, the wind moving soft and steady, and when the light began to dip, they returned to the house together, not by habit, not by routine, but because there was nowhere else they needed to be. And inside, the lantern was lit again, its glow steady, familiar, and Ethan set the cups on the table without thinking, filling them the same way he always had. And when he slid one toward her, she took it without hesitation, her fingers resting lightly against the edge as she had done before. And for a moment they simply sat there, the silence between them no longer something to cross, but something to share. After a while, Nayeli lifted her gaze, meeting his directly, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before, not uncertainty, not distance, but something clearer, something that had taken shape over time and now stood without needing to be hidden. And she spoke, her voice steady. They will speak of this in your town. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, not surprised, not concerned, just aware. They always do, he replied, and there was no resistance in it, no attempt to deny or avoid, just the acceptance of something that existed beyond his control. She watched him for a moment longer, then added, in my home, they will not speak. And that made him glance at her again, his brow tightening slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition of something different, something he did not fully understand yet. And she continued, her voice softer now, because it is already known, and the words settled between them with a quiet weight, not heavy, but certain. And Ethan nodded once, slow and steady, because he understood enough to know that some things do not need to be said to be real. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, carrying the cooler edge of evening, and the land seemed to exhale, the heat easing, the lights softening into long shadows that stretched across the yard. and inside, the lantern flickered gently, its glow steady but alive, casting their shadows onto the wall in a way that no longer felt separate. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his posture easing, his gaze steady on her. And for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing left to ask, nothing left to prove, only something to acknowledge. You stayed, he said again, not because he needed to hear it, but because it mattered to say it. And Nayeli held his gaze, her expression calm, her voice certain. I chose, she repeated, and this time there was no pause after, no space left unfilled, because the meaning had already settled into the room, into the land, into everything that had led them here. The night deepened slowly, the world beyond the house growing quieter with each passing moment, and as the lantern burned low, Ethan rose without thinking, stepping outside for a breath of air, and Nayeli followed after a moment, not because she needed to, but because she chose to share the same space. And they stood there together, looking out over the land that had witnessed every step of this change, every quiet decision, every moment that had brought them from strangers to something else entirely, something that did not need a name to exist. And as the wind moved softly across the plains, carrying away the last warmth of the day, neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left to say, only something to continue, something that had already become part of who they were, not by force, not by promise, but by the simple act of staying when leaving had always been an option. The next day carried a different kind of weight, not heavy, not pressing, but present in the way the air seemed to settle closer to the ground, like the land itself was holding something steady. And Ethan felt it the moment he stepped outside, the familiar creak of the porch beneath his boots sounding sharper, clearer, as if every small detail had found its place. Nayeli was already there again, but not at the well, not at the fence. She stood near the center of the yard, where the dust lay smooth and untouched, her posture still, her gaze not fixed on the horizon but on the ground before her, as if she was measuring something unseen. And when Ethan approached, she did not look up right away. She simply said, "This place remembers," her voice quiet, certain, and Ethan paused, his eyes moving over the yard, the fence, the well, the house itself, then back to her. "It does," he replied, his tone steady. "Just takes time to hear it." And for a moment they stood there together, not speaking, not moving, just listening to something that did not carry sound. The morning unfolded in that same quiet rhythm, but there was something beneath it now, something that felt like a line had been crossed and could not be returned from. And Ethan found himself working with a different kind of awareness, not watching her out of habit, not measuring distance, but simply knowing she was there, the same way he knew the shape of the land without looking. And Nayeli moved through the space with the same certainty, her steps no longer careful, no longer testing, but grounded, as if each place she stood had already been chosen before she arrived. By midday, the heat settled over the land again, the kind that pressed down without sound, and Ethan leaned against the fence, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze drifting outward. And for the first time in years, he did not feel the pull of leaving, not the quiet thought that had always sat somewhere in the back of his mind, the idea that one day he might ride out and not return, because now there was something here that did not belong to the past, something that existed in the present, and that alone was enough to hold him. Nayeli stepped beside him, closer than she had before, not by accident, not by habit, but by choice, and she followed his gaze for a moment before speaking, her voice softer than the wind. "In my home, when two people choose the same place, the land sees them as one path." And Ethan let the words settle, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to see what she saw. And then he nodded, slow and certain. "Out here, a man would say the same thing," he said, just in fewer words. And there was something in that exchange that felt final, not in an ending sense, but in a beginning that had already taken root. The afternoon passed without interruption, the land holding its quiet, and when the light began to soften, they returned to the house as they always did, the movement between outside and inside no longer marked by hesitation, no longer something to notice, just part of the day. And Ethan lit the lantern again, its glow steady, and set it between them without thought, the same as before, but now it felt like something shared, something that belonged to both of them without needing to be claimed. Naeli sat across from him, her posture relaxed, her hands resting lightly on the table, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other, not searching, not questioning, just present. And Ethan spoke then, his voice low, steady. There will come a day when someone asks what this is, and it was not a warning, not a concern, just a truth placed between them, and Naeli did not look away, her gaze holding his without wavering. And what will you say? She asked, and there was no challenge in it, no demand, only curiosity, and Ethan considered that, his eyes lowering for a brief second before lifting again. I will say nothing, he answered, because they will not understand it from words. And the room held that answer quietly, the lantern flickering slightly as if acknowledging it. And Naeli gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in recognition. In my home, it is the same, she said. The truth is not spoken, it is lived. And the words settled into the space between them with a kind of calm certainty that did not need to be repeated. Outside, the wind moved gently across the land, carrying the last warmth of the day with it, and the sky darkened slowly, the stars beginning to appear one by one. And Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture easing in a way that felt different now, less guarded, less alone. And Naeli remained where she was, her presence steady, her gaze calm, and for a long while neither of them spoke again, because there was nothing left to define, nothing left to prove, only something to continue, something that had already become part of the place itself, woven into the quiet rhythm of the days, the steady light of the lantern, the shared space that no longer felt borrowed, but chosen. And as the night deepened and the world beyond the house faded into silence, Ethan rose once more, stepping outside for a moment, and Naeli followed after him, not because she needed to, but because she chose to stand in the same place, under the same sky. And together they looked out over the land that had witnessed every step of this change, every quiet decision, every moment that had brought them here. And in that stillness, there was no doubt left, no distance remaining, only the quiet truth of something that had become real without ever needing to be named. The final morning did not announce itself with anything new, no sound, no shift in the wind, no sign that something had reached its end, because out here, endings do not arrive the way people expect them to. They settle quietly into what has already begun, and Ethan stepped outside with the same steady motion as every day before, his boots finding the same place on the porch, his eyes lifting to the same stretch of land that now felt different in a way he no longer tried to explain. Naeli was already there, not at the edge, not near the well, but standing beside the door, closer than she had ever stood before, her presence no longer something that moved through the space, but something that belonged to it. And when he glanced at her, there was no distance left in her gaze, no question waiting to be answered, only something calm, something certain. They did not speak at first, because there was no need. The silence between them had long since stopped being empty. It had become something that held everything they had not said, everything they had chosen without words. And Ethan stepped down from the porch, his hands moving to the familiar tasks without thought. The bucket lifted, the rope drawn, the water poured, and when he set down the 2 cups, he did not pause. He did not look to see if she would come, because he already knew. Naeli stepped forward, her movement steady, unhurried, and she took one of the cups without hesitation, her fingers brushing the edge in that same quiet way. And for a moment they stood there together, the morning light soft against them, the land still and open, and it felt less like the beginning of a day and more like the continuation of something that had already been decided. The hours passed as they always did, the work simple, the rhythm steady. But there was a difference now, not in what they did, but in how it felt, every step carrying the weight of something shared, something that no longer needed to be proven. And by midday, Ethan found himself standing at the fence again, his gaze drifting out across the plains, and for the first time, he did not look beyond it. He did not measure the distance to anything else. He simply stood, and Naeli stood beside him, close enough that there was no space left to define, and she spoke softly, her voice carrying that same quiet certainty. In my home, when a path is walked together long enough, it is no longer seen as two. And Ethan nodded once, his eyes still on the horizon. Out here, a man would just say it feels right. he replied, and there was something in that simplicity that held more truth than anything else. The afternoon faded slowly, the sun lowering, the light stretching across the land in long, quiet lines, and they returned to the house as they always did. The movement between outside and inside no longer marked by anything at all, just part of what the day had become, and Ethan lit the lantern again, its glow steady, familiar, and placed it on the table between them. And this time, he did not sit right away. He stood for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the wood, his gaze lifting to meet hers, and there was something in that look that carried everything that had not been spoken, everything that had been chosen without force. Nayeli met his gaze without hesitation, her posture relaxed, her presence steady, and for a moment the world outside the house seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the quiet space between them, the steady light of the lantern, and the understanding that had grown there without needing to be named. Ethan finally sat, his movements slow, deliberate, and she did the same. The chairs no longer placed across from each other by distance, but by choice, and the silence that followed was not waiting for anything. It was simply there, complete. After a while, Ethan reached for the cup again, filling it as he always had, and set it down between them, not sliding it across this time, not offering it as something separate, but leaving it where both could reach. And Nayeli watched that small motion, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged but deeper, and she reached for it as well, her hand resting near his for just a second longer than before, not enough to claim, not enough to define, but enough to be felt. Outside, the wind moved softly across the land, carrying the last warmth of the day with it, and the sky darkened slowly, the first stars appearing one by one, and Ethan leaned back slightly, his posture easing completely now, the weight he had carried for so long no longer present in the same way. And Nayeli remained where she was, her presence steady, her gaze calm, and for the first time, neither of them looked toward the horizon, because there was nothing out there they needed to measure anymore. The lantern burned low as the night settled in, its glow soft and constant, casting their shadows onto the wall, and this time the shadows did not stand apart. They met. They held the same space without overlap, without separation, just there, and as the quiet deepened, Ethan finally spoke, his voice lower than before, carrying no question, no doubt, only acknowledgement. We did not pretend this long. And Nayeli's eyes held his, her voice just as steady, just as certain. No, she said, we did not. And the words settled into the room without weight, without need for anything more, because the truth of them had already been lived, not spoken, and outside, beyond the walls, beyond the fence, beyond the land itself, the world continued as it always had. But inside that small house, under the steady light of a single lantern, something had ended without breaking, and something else had begun without needing to be declared, something quiet, something real, something that would not be told in words, only seen in the way two people stayed, day after day, when leaving was still possible.